Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to introduce our SGS webinar, KCMA members and ESG, the sustainability mandate. Thank you so much to KCMA for having us today, and thank you to Angela and Crystal Cabinet Works for the introduction. We're very happy to be here. Today's webinar will cover a bit of an introduction about SGS, definitions and a short history, 5 North American drivers, 5-step cycle for KCMA members, KCMA material topic examples, and a short Q&A at the end. We will now introduce ourselves. My name is Kim LaFrancois, and I am the Regional Sales Manager for the industrial sector here at SGS, but more recently my focus has been on sustainability and ESG. I've been in the testing, inspection, and certification industry for nearly 10 years, working with many different clients throughout various industries. The other speaker joining us today is Adam Hammis. Adam is the ESG Director here at SGS and has 20 years of experience as corporate ESG sustainability consultant, author, and instructor. Adam has founded multiple organizations and has an MBA with international education and leadership experience, integrating ESG and CSR and sustainability into corporate strategy. He has also taken many different courses to become a competent and effective resource for ESG and sustainability. I'll now pass it over to Adam so we can dive right in. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. And just so we can get through, I won't spend a ton of time on who SGS is, but I just wanted to reiterate my thanks to everyone who was able to be on the webinar, to Angela, who I met at higher training and have since really gotten to know, and really appreciate the KCMA members that are able to attend today. I will look back and forth so I don't miss questions. So if you see me going back and forth, I have 2 screens up. I just like to show people you don't think I'm not paying attention to my own presentation. But if you don't know who SGS is, we like to say boots on the ground around the world. We are a world leader in inspection, verification, testing, and certification, the global benchmark for quality and integrity, 96,000 employees in 2,700 offices. And so if you haven't heard of us, we're usually on the back end doing a lot of technical expertise work. We do have sustainability embedded in our company for a very long time, from the CEO to the bottom, and even into the board. And we have been working on this. We're not new. We have 25 plus years of sustainability experience. Even before ESG was a popular term, we were working on working groups. We're not only launching new standards, but being verification and validation bodies for those standards in lots of different sectors across the world. And we like to also say that we hold ourselves to a very high standard. So the agencies that would score your companies and rate you on your performance with ESG and sustainability do so with us as well. We are publicly traded, and we have very high rankings in every way that you can be ranked, with all of these that you see and more. And just to get a kind of a baseline for everybody, especially with KCMA, we're familiar with you, but it's a good get a barometer of have your organization published an ESG or sustainability report, because that's one question that is a great starting point of, okay, so where do you want to go? Where are you in the process? So I'm going to relaunch this because we were playing around with it earlier. And I'm going to see if this poll works. I'm going to leave it open for about 15 to 20 seconds and see how things go. But the idea of this is it just shows some level of progress you've made, because to publish any type of report, your company has had to have put in the work and organize the content, and really have some familiarity with the aspects and the topics and the KPIs and everything like that. So just to get a good sense of where people are. I'll give it about 10 more seconds because most of the people have already participated. And then I will share. Thanks for everyone for answering. So here's the results. You know, the overwhelming, which is very popular, very common, I should say, is not having a report yet. Some folks, especially if you're small, privately held, it is the drivers are maybe not there. We're going to talk about that in a second. Yes, my hat is off to those of you who have and don't know. Is also depends on your role in the company. Some companies don't publicize or don't have the internal marketing or the internal communications that maybe they wish they did. But if you go looking, usually I don't know is a no, because your company would be proud of the work they did and maybe want to share it with you at that point. So I'm going to keep going and say, before we talk about anything, it's nice to know that we all agree on what it is that we're talking about. So I'm going to give you a very brief definitions and quick history, because I think that's also important. And then we'll dive in pretty deep. So ESG, the simplest definition that I hope everyone can remember is just non-financial reporting. It's that simple. It does get a lot more complicated, but if you want to simplify it down to those three buckets, there's the obvious financial reporting that companies do, mostly publicly traded companies, which is where ESG came from. But we'll talk about how it came to ESG, these particular three letters. But those are the three categories that most of the non-financial reporting happens in. And it did come out of the publicly traded sphere with investor pressure, but environmental, social, and governance. And it is the reportable data for companies, often publicly traded, but as you can see in the next few slides, we'll talk about how it's definitely expanding beyond just publicly traded companies. So let's talk about brief history in the best I can. And so not going too far back, but in the 1920s, historical cost accounting was, for accuracy, everything pre-1930 was what financial statements were really focused on. Then in 1929, something happened called the Great Depression. Not only did the London and New York Stock exchanges completely crash, but all the reforms that came after that were really targeted at companies not disclosing enough information or disclosing false or misleading information. And the focus for those securities was then to put the focus on greater transparency and defining what are your material issues so as not to distract investors from what was really important. So you give them another 10 years, and what happened was the American Institute of Accountants, the AIA, had a committee on accounting procedure, the CAP, and they began for the first time permitting exceptions to historical cost accounting within GAAP, or generally accepted accounting principles. Go another 10 years, you might notice this slow, consistent shift, but it takes a decade, and then the APB, the Accounting Principles Board, replaced CAP, and they established, their entire purpose was to establish standardization for practice under the general accounting principles. Then in the 1960s, another 10 years, the whole profession really started re-envisioning, hey, we have all these exceptions. What is the purpose of financial statements? And so we started shifting away from accuracy and to this term called decision usefulness. And that was for the reported information and who were the users. It needed to be decision useful for those users. And then it took another 10 years, and a joint initiative across internationally with the IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board. The US, we always like to do our own thing. We created FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, but they were kind of lockstep. They replaced that APB committee, and they started focusing on financial reports to include decision useful information. And the three areas that they said were most important, that what defined decision useful, were future discounted cash flows, the financial piece, for the future forward-looking financials, the social goals of the company, and the environmental externalities that were not being captured in their finances. So those are the three things. And then companies began reporting non-GAAP measures for the first time for a more complete picture of their performance. Also, market valuations at this point, for the very first time, started to shift away from tangible to intangible assets. And as a little benchmark, we'll come back to this, but in 1975, 83% of the S&P 500 market valuation were tangible assets, physical things, buildings, cars, plants, equipment, stuff. And we'll come back to that later. In 1980, for the first time, you started to see the regulatory filings in the US add two sections. The non-financial disclosures were the management commentary and what's recently called, now called the MD&A, but the management's discussion and analysis. And prior to 1980, those did not exist. So that's the slow, consistent shift to decision useful, non-financial data in the realm of financial responsibility, really following those market crashes of the late 20s. So then you had, we talk about this in another training, but you had an entire environmental and social movement happening parallel to that. But in the early 90s was the first time that they actually started to combine, and where ESG started to create business tools for those other categories, social goals and environmental externalities. So in 1994, you had the first company, a publicly traded company, Interface. They established this Mission Zero, complete sustainability goal, very comprehensive. In 1997, GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, was a comprehensive reporting tool that was launched. In 1998, the best companies to work for was two economists started printing a list. Robert Levering and Milton Moskowitz is the Fortune 100's best companies to work for, and they were listed, scored on E, S, and G criteria. We'll come back to that in a little bit. 2000, the Millennial Goals came from the United Nations. I think they started out with 8 originally. It was 15-year global goals that had mostly about governments and regions and how we're going to deal with poverty and things like that. But there were tools involved in how to help work towards that. The Global Compact in 2004, that was a business group. They were launched by corporate leaders and had 10 business principles for responsible business, 6 social, 3 environmental, 1 governance. In 2007, for the marketing world, started to identify what was called the low-cost consumer market, lifestyles of health and sustainability that were willing to pay more, or at least if things had price parity, they would choose the more socially or environmentally responsible product or service. And at the time, there's 13% of the population that met that criteria. In 2008, we had the Great Recession. There really was a lull, kind of a drop in almost everything ESG related, except for things that were personally impacting people's health and wellness. So kind of like the selfish gene kicked in, and we would still spend more on our personal health and wellness and feeling good. But some of the other things took a real hit in 2008 and then started climbing again. In 2009, the Integrated Reporting Foundation was founded. Their entire purpose was to say, hey, if these are material issues, we need to focus on putting them in our financials or next to our financials. We should get rid of all the fluff and just have the things that are truly material to us as a company and report those like we would report our financials, instead of what you typically saw were 40, 100-page sustainability reports that were not tied anywhere directly to your financial statements. In 2011, SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards, came out with 77 standards for 77 different industries to really kind of move forward and fast forward for a lot of different organizations. Say, if you're in this industry, just report these material topics. Some people love it for that reason. Some people criticize it for that reason, but it was a great tool. And then also in 2011, what happened was they did an economic analysis. Alex Edmonds from Wharton University published research that showed for over about 20-year span from 1984 to 2009, all those companies listed on the Fortune 100 best companies list were outperforming their peers by about 2 to 3% financially. And in 2016, BlackRock sent their first ESG letter out to all of their clients and said, hey, we're going to start looking at ESG pretty strongly. And if you're not performing, we're going to start taking action. And then 2020, for the first time, we had a huge swell, 90%. So that flipped from 1975 that we talked about, where 83% of the S&P 500 was tangible market valuation. Now, most of market valuation for publicly traded companies is intangible, things like goodwill, brand value, things that are really hard to put your finger on, but that can change and disappear quickly with the changing tides of, do people think you're doing good socially? Do you have really bad PR? Do you have a huge kind of social ill pop up in the media? Did you get into a lawsuit? And you can lose a lot of that intangible value quickly. And 90% is a lot. And then 2022, just recently in the economic survey of the World Economic Forum, nearly 1,000 business leaders, climate risk had been on the list for a very long time, but these are just pure economic risks. Climate for the first time was at the top of the list, so as the #1 economic risk that most people internationally felt that they were facing. And so that's just I apologize for the long history, but if you see anything, the slow and steady direction of this movement is that first, we weren't really paying attention to anything except pure historical cost accounting. And even when we started to identify that E, S, and G issues were important on financial reporting, for the last 20 years, we didn't have strong business tools. And today we do. For the first time, we're sort of hitting that peak where the tools are all in place and they're available to manage these things, and investors are seeing that it's an issue. And then the definitions of ESG and sustainability are also good to understand. ESG is purely, for most people's definition, is financial materiality. If you look at people, planet, and profit, the 3 Ps or the 3 Es, however you want to define it, ESG is purely the impacts of environmental and social issues on the business. If you look at impact materiality, that's typically where you're adding the feel-good stuff. The sustainability term is typically the impacts of the business on society and the planet. And that is not what ESG is sort of the base, the starting point, which is really the pure financial materiality. You can't talk about sustainability. People use these words in very different ways, but if you want to really slice it apart, if you put these together, you'll often hear, especially coming out of Europe or the GRI framework, Global Reporting Initiative, double materiality. They want you to consider both financial materiality to the business, but also impact materiality of the business on society and the planet. And what that has created is sort of 2 lanes. Most of the standards and frameworks that we see today, the Integrated Reporting Foundation, SASB, and the TCFD, which is a climate standard, are all on the same track. It's all investor driven. It's pure financial materiality. They all joined forces and were embedded in the Value Reporting Foundation 2 years ago, and they've just been absorbed into the International Financial Reporting Standards, or IFRS, just this last year, I think. And so that's all for investors. The publicly traded companies are really aligning behind those. And then there are the additional things like the GRI, which is trying to align with things like SASB. They're adding sector-specific standards, but it is double materiality. They're not going away from impact materiality. It's sort of the feel-good. Consumers are interested, the public is interested, governments are interested, employees are interested, and so it's not, they're going to keep their own lane. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they've created some business tools as well, like SDG Impact, and they're really in the pure sustainability realm. They include ESG, but the stuff on the top is just a purely investor-driven initiative. So I talked a lot. If you want to have type questions into the chat box, but I'm going to throw up the next poll. And I actually do have, by saying 90%, so Caleb has a good question. Are you saying 90% of a company's value is not related to its assets and production? Great question, Caleb. I'm saying in the S&P 500 combined, all of it, yes, 90% of the company's valuation is not directly tied to assets and production. It's tied to intangibles like goodwill, I think, intellectual property rights, patents, things like that, goodwill, brand value. It's that category. It's not assets and production, correct? The next poll that I wanted to throw up is, what if any trends does your business see in stakeholder expectations for ESG and sustainability performance? So what are you hearing from, and stakeholders is not just shareholders. A lot of you probably don't have shareholders, but you have government regulators, you have customers, you have industry association, you have peers and competitors, you have employees. You know, what are you seeing from a trend? I'll let it run for about 10 more seconds because we're getting a lot of participation, so thank you. And I don't want anyone to ever think that I'm saying that it's the same for every company. What I'm trying to show you is like big trends, what's happening in general, but you should never just take an off-the-shelf answer or an off-the-shelf strategy for your company. You should do your own analysis, which we'll talk a lot about today. So I'll end the poll and share the results. But as you can see, a lot of folks, none and no change, a lot increasing. And what I think is good is no one sees it decreasing or going away. And I think that's very generally helpful, but it's more helpful to actually get in to the weeds and see what does it mean for your company. So let's do that and talk about what is actually driving North American business and how that might affect you. So here's what it looks like. The number one, because it's coming, ESG came out of the public sphere, tends to be these ESG ratings. There's lots of different versions of them, but these are rating agencies that are scoring companies that are publicly traded for the most part without their permission. It's publicly available data is what they're scraping. And then different investor groups and creditors, financial institutions, are making buy, sell, and lend decisions with that data. So Dow Jones is just the biggest 300 companies in the world. MSCI has 8,500 companies that they've scored. ISS has scored almost 12,000, and Sustainalytics has 20,000. These are all for publicly traded companies. If you're private, you can request a special score, but you have to have a real strong reason. Most of them, the strong reason is they want to go public. And they all have different weighted proprietary algorithms. They do have a lot of subcategory and industry comparison tools now that are similar and aligned based on the criticism they've received over the past 20 years. But these are really what's driving it, because there are actual buy, lend, and sell decisions being made using these scores. Then from those big publicly traded companies, you tend to have your supply chain being impacted. So if you have a big supply chain customer downstream and you're upstream from them, their score is now being impacted by your performance. So your ESG scores and the scoring agencies are prioritizing supply chain impacts in their algorithms. Therefore, companies like Walmart, Target, Home Depot, Lowe's, Steelcase, now still, they're all starting to get really interested in how do we improve and actually get transparency into our supply chain's performance. One example is ISO 14064-1. That's a greenhouse gas standard in ISO. It requires indirect emissions, where in the past, greenhouse gas protocol was the most important standard that everyone used internationally. It was still optional, but now supply chain emissions with greenhouse gases are no longer optional. You have to do a significance evaluation and a risk assessment, and you do have to include those or justify why you're excluding them. That changed in 2018. And then we have large global brand performance. Is what you see are these folks like the Walmarts and Targets and Home Depot and Lowe's, Steelcase, Now Steel. All of those are in EcoVadis and using CDP. They actually request or soft mandate to their suppliers that you need to start disclosing your performance within one of these tools or both. And CDP and EcoVadis are other tools, but they are ramping up quickly. CDP only has 13,000 because it's purely for climate disclosure, but EcoVadis is the fastest growing. It has 100,000 users, and it's growing at a rapid pace because hundreds or even thousands of suppliers at a time are jumping on because a brand requested that they do so. So EcoVadis has ramped up faster than any other scoring agency, and people like it a little more because it's not publicly available. They don't do it without your permission. With publicly available data, it is a self-reporting tool, and there is some privacy to it. You basically give permission to the larger brand customer, and only they can see your score. So I would see that that's going to continue to rise quickly, but definitely is a thing. This is little promotion, but we do have rating boost scores. There's some quick ways to really get in and improve your scores, but I won't spend a ton of time on that, but we have services in all of these areas. The North American driver, which a lot of people are surprised by, but if you're not an international supply chain, you really have a benefit here. Regulatory wise, Canada and the US are usually about 5 years behind, and that's consistent with ESG and sustainability. Europe is a lot further ahead, East Asia, South America. So if you're in those markets, you absolutely are going to be impacted by regulation. But here in the US, it's purely on climate. So climate disclosure, even in Canada and the US, we have the federal supplier rules, both in Canada and the US. That means the government has put suppliers on notice that they have to start reporting. But we only have a proposed SEC ruling change, and it's limited to climate disclosures, and that has not passed yet. And it probably won't pass until late this year or early next year with some clear modifications. And so climate is the issue at hand when it comes to regulation in North America. But if you're tied to the European Union, or even, Brazil's pretty strong on just climate, the European Union has a very comprehensive CSRD regulation for all of ESG and sustainability, and it's really important to look into that if you have a supply chain and are impacted by the European Union. Last, fourth, and fifth are going to be quite a stair step down. These are really, especially if you're in a consumer product market, if you're selling directly to individuals, this is going to be way more of an impact to you. But the LOHAS consumer market continues to expand pretty rapidly. It's a $546 billion market of individuals who expect and want to pay more for products that are socially and environmentally responsible. The US is 23% of the market today, and it's about 10% of that increases every year. It's not going to be 33% next year, just to clarify. Japan, New Zealand, other markets that are really popular. And if you look at the McKinsey survey of consumers, they said 70% are actually willing to pay more for green products that perform well. So compared to this 23% of how they define LOHAS, it could be higher. So when you look at some of these consultant surveys, might take them with a grain of salt. But 50% of companies, this is what's interesting, is say that business growth is what's driving their sustainability initiatives, is that they're seeing new markets opening up for them, new products, new service lines that are related to ESG, that they're actually seeing that growth come. And that's why they're entering these new markets. And then North America driver number 5, which I think is still going to be a slow roll, but it's increasing more and more, is the war for talent. And employees are asking for this. A 2020 survey of UK-based office workers said 83% thought their employer was not doing enough to tackle sustainability and climate change. 65% would prefer working for a different company with stronger environmental policies. And then an IBM survey, which they do every year, 16,000 employees across 10 countries, 67% said they were more willing to apply for and accept positions with quote unquote what they thought were sustainable companies. You will never have the same drivers, but you'll have a mix. You'll tend to have a primary driver, a secondary driver. Some people might have all 5, but it's really important to know what are the drivers for your business if you're going to get into ESG and sustainability. And so I'm going to pop open this new question, and well, this is the one we talked about. It's a little different order. Here we go. So this you may not know, but what is your general sense? What is the number one, the primary driver if your organization was going to take on ESG and sustainability? What was going to be driving that for you? Is it ESG ratings? Is it supply chain customers? Is it regulation? Is it just your consumers demanding it? Are your employees expecting it, or something else? Whatever you want that to be. And if you think it's something else, feel free to drop that in the webinar chat function just to give us some flavor of what other people are seeing. All right, slowing down a little bit, so I'll give you about 5-10 more seconds. And it's just your best guess, what you think it is. All right, I'm gonna close the poll and share now. So we got a really nice balance, except employees, which I think is interesting. I would just keep an eye on that. And it does really depend on who you are and what your company is, where you're located. But I love the balance of a little bit of supply chain, customers, regulations, consumers, and other. If you do want to throw your ideas into the chat, could just be because you believe in it, could be something else. But I think that's really interesting to look at. Moving on, let's talk about how it actually happens. So if you're a KCMA member and you want to look at ESG, how does performance happen within your company? And these are the 5 steps of the ESG cycle that I will say can take, the first time you go through the step can take a while, could take 2 years, could take 3 years, but almost inevitably, if you go through the cycle, if you start publishing a report, either internally or externally, you're going to start this as an annual process. And you'll get more mature with every cycle that you go through. It's never a one and done, but awareness is the first step. You're looking at large issues and trends in your industry. What are the strategies that are happening? And then once you have awareness of the issues, you're going to start to prioritize. You're going to really say, what are our priorities? And you typically do a materiality assessment. You look at risks and opportunities. It often involves stakeholder engagement, which we'll talk about, before you move into actually creating a strategy. You have to do a lot of that prioritizing before you can build a strategy around those priorities. Then it has vision, KPIs, goals, plans, really high level. You have to define what it is you're going to do before you actually move into execution, initiatives, projects, quality. risk assessment, the things that you really get into some topic specific things that you're doing at the boots on the ground level, and then some form of reporting. It could be internal, but you're usually reporting management, like how are we managing this? What's the approach? But also performance. You want to measure how are we doing and how are we doing over time. And at that point, you will eventually circle all the way back around and say, what did we not know the first time? What do we need to increase our competencies on and our understanding so we can check our priorities? You're not going to throw it out the window, but you are going to revisit. You're going to update your strategy if needed so you can go back and execute and then report again and do it all over again. This sequence also mitigates risk. So it's really important to think about internal leadership can have some maybe uncomfortable behind closed doors meetings that you don't want on social media, you don't want out there in the public eye, but you can have really valuable conversations. And it's usually that internal leadership group. That's why they're color coded differently. You are going to have internal stakeholders doing the execution. Your business partners are going to start to see you do things differently. Your employees are going to start to see you do things differently once you begin execution. But once you actually report anything that goes public, good luck controlling it. Once you put it out there as a public document, all external stakeholders are going to have insight or visibility into your planning. So that's why mitigating risk is good, to take your time on those first 3 steps and get it, I don't want to say right, but get it to where you're happy and you're confident in your first steps. That's why there's typically role-based leadership. So you should not expect everybody, one person to be doing all of it and the same people to be doing different parts of the steps. It's really 3 different roles. There's a strategist role. Typically, there's some sort of senior ESG committee, which is board level, C-suite, VPs and directors. You might have a dedicated ESG professional and lead counsel, because there's a lot of legal and risks that you want to be understanding about the organization and your industry. And you conduct all 3 of those steps with the same group. Then execution becomes in the weeds. Implementers are project managers, operations managers, subject matter experts, risk, quality managers. And those are each topic by topic. They can be a little more siloed in the execution phase. And then you have a reporting group. If you're a reporter, you're on the communications team, the marketing team, investors relations person, government affairs and legal compliance, anything that is very important and critical, how accurate, and the types of things that you not only aren't reporting, but maybe the things you aren't reporting. And those all there are risks and opportunities with all of that. But there are 3 very distinct different groups doing different parts of the work that should all communicate with each other. Here's an example. Master Brand, as you know, is very large, they're in small towns across the United States, but they do have a public report, which is actually really good to look into people's process. So first, you can see they talk about governance, and they identify who in their report is on not only a board of directors, but which of them sit on the ESG committee related to social, environmental, and governance issues. Then they talk about how they do their stakeholder engagement and all the different types of stakeholder engagement that they conducted to identify their material topics when it comes to ESG. And then there's actually the contents, and they break the report into very specific background on the company, environmental, social, and governance. Each of these topics has multiple pages on it and KPIs, but that you can see the nice flow of steps 1, 2, and 3 are not only conducted, but they're documented, and they share that as a part of their story moving forward. Here's a different example of Masco. They have actually a lot of international, like 9 international locations, but 30 manufacturing facilities across the US. They also show, here's our board structure, here's how we manage through our, even as high as our audit committee, our ESG functionality. Then they talk about definitely their customer experience, but they talk about all the different stakeholders that they engaged with: employees, consumers, channel partners, shareholders, communities, and environment, before they get into, and this is a much larger report. And then if you look at how they broke their issues down, but they have environmental sustainability, which is their E, broken into all these different categories and KPIs, and investing in our employees, which is the big part of their S. And then they do have governance pieces as well, but it's hard to sample from all the different types of reports. But just a good example of how that flows in the first 3 steps. And it's important to document that and do it well so that you're confident going out and publicly letting people know that this is what we're going to do, but almost more importantly, this is what we're not going to do. So shows you a quick steps. It's a lot of information. If you definitely have questions, throw them in the chat. But the next polling question is, which steps of the ESG cycle fit strongest with your job role? So do you see yourself as a strategist in your role with your company? Do you see yourself as an implementer? Are you here as a reporter, or are you some other? Maybe you're a consultant helping with all those parts. Maybe you're not involved at this point. But give a sense of where you think you would fit. Remember, strategist does, broad awareness, then priorities, and then creating the strategy. Whereas an implementer, you might own the energy component, or you might own the wellness component, and you are doing the day-to-day grind. And then reporter is obvious. You're on the team that's putting out publications, or submitting to regulators, or submitting to scoring agencies or reporting platforms, things like that. I'll give you 5 more seconds because a couple people just popped in now in the poll, but this is not uncommon, especially when you're trying to come to a webinar to learn about this. Strategists are most common because you need the strategy before you get to the implementation. It's not to say that you won't have implemented some really great things over the past, but you won't have organized them into a clear, easy to understand, and concise, maybe is a better term, strategy that people can understand when you communicate it later. And then reporters are also really important. They need to understand the big picture, especially some of the risks in reporting, and they can inform strategy as well. And we've got some others. Again, if you want to type in the chat what your other is, we're all for it. Then I want to move on. Just to offer, we do have ESG and sustainability training. I think Angela was in this training, but we do offer like a really short video on-demand course that covers a lot more than what we did today. But then we have actually in September, the 5th, 6th, and 7th, we have a strategy for strategists. We have a course for strategy, a course for implementation, and a course for communications. You can take them all, but we really want to help people in their direct role at the company. So let's talk about KCMA member material topics, because we can't do your stakeholder engagement and materiality assessment for you here on this webinar, but we can give you an example of some of the tools that exist. So if we were to go look at, which we can, the MSCI scoring algorithms and the platform that they use, as well as the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. They have standards for specific industries. We can cross-reference that with several other standards, and when we do, we can tell you that the material topics for cabinetry come down in a pretty short list. This isn't the only list, and they get a little more complicated once you dive in, but governance is almost always at the top of everyone's list. Definitely from an investor standpoint, they want to know that you've got a governing body in place looking at these issues yourself to understand the risks and the opportunities. And then you get into the actual topics. Health and safety and labor management, they're not identical all the time, but those are two very highly, they're very highly scored. Toxic emissions and waste, specifically chemical management, if you're applying adhesives, chemicals, stains, things like that. And then carbon emissions, energy management is a subset of carbon emissions, but it's basically your climate footprint, as well as your product life cycle environmental impacts. So other things in the supply chain environmentally, specifically wood supply chain management comes to mind because you're building cabinets out of wood. And so those come to the top of the list as the material topics that are relevant financially for this industry. Again, it's very broad. It's a great starting point, but you should always look at your business specifically. And then we can look at going deeper and saying, what does it actually look like to do something and to implement in one of these categories? So I'm going to go back really quick because we had would you please define governance outside of the board structure? Great question, Angela. So governance, typically this is not just governance purely, this is ESG governance. So how are you governing? How are the governance structures in your organization integrating the ESG components of that? And so that's the main thing is, do you have an ESG committee, a separate committee? Who are they and what are their qualifications? Do you have subcommittees, working groups that go down into the organization for actually implementation and reporting? What does that all look like? Are incentives tied to their performance on ESG topics? Have you identified your material topics? What was the process you went through? It's a lot of governance. You could just call it context. It's definitely governance and who is running the show, but what is the context? What kind of background information have you looked at? And what kind of confidence can you give people, like investors, confidence that you're doing the right things for the right reasons and that they are financially material to the company, typically as a risk, but also as an opportunity. So that's a long-winded answer, but it's a lot of those types of things beyond general governance, which is like board independence and anti-bribery and things like that. Those sort of can give you points, I guess, towards scoring, but they're really looking at how are you governing ESG as a whole. So we're going to get into implementation, give you a snapshot of basically this 5 stages of performance model that has been well documented, well researched by people for 30 some years. And everyone who has researched it has come up with the same basically 5 stages for ESG and sustainability topics. What are the phases that they actually go through when they start out very low in performance to going very high in performance? And if you can break it down, which I love, into something even simpler, I think it was the woman, Dawn Mills. Yep. She had these characterizations. So if you remember, pre-compliance, ostrich head in the sand; tortoise, compliance, just doing the bare minimum; efficiency, rhino, it's like the hard work, the data collection, and really just doing process improvement. Where then there's the pack wolf, which is working as a team kind of outside of your normal silos, and effectiveness, not even outside of departments, but outside of your organization, with competitors, with across industries, with government regulators, things like that. And visionary, the puma, is an agile creature who's like king of the jungle and can move and adapt quickly, and also is like the top level performer. You've kind of reached some of these upper echelons of kind of across the finish line, sometimes people say, that has some risks in it, but you really feel like you've done some industry best work. And so ESG is the bottom. If you really think about what applies to financial materiality purely, that you should, from an ESG standpoint, be getting out of pre-compliance, getting into compliance, and then you should be looking at efficiencies throughout your company. And those are clear financial materiality issues. And then sustainability takes it even further. There's some crossover with efficiency. Usually no one in the sustainability conversation is talking about just complying with the law, but they are talking about doing out-of-the-box thinking, pushing performance up to higher and higher levels, where you're actually talking about social good, environmental good, things like that. So let's talk about 2 big issues that always hit people's radars: climate action, and kind of walk through it stage by stage. So you don't want to be failing inspections, have unfulfilled mandatory reporting, or be subject to legal fines and fees around anything climate related. There's not a ton of climate action regulation, but there are energy related. If you want to break down climate, it's a subset of energy, fuel, refrigerant, and those types of things that do offset emissions, equipment, processing, refining, and the supply chain as well. So anything you want to think about that could be regulatory and you're not doing it, it's really run by the risk managers, and you're trying to move out of non-compliance or pre-compliance as fast as you can. When you get into compliance, it's usually nothing to write home about. No one really cares unless you're not doing it, but it does have a significant improvement financially for the company that you're passing inspections, you're fulfilling any mandatory reporting, you're avoiding legal fees and fines, and it's very important. It's a significant step up from the first stage, but you want to be in efficiency with almost anything. You have quality managers now getting involved. You're having, for climate specifically, you're talking about getting an emissions inventory done, starting to voluntarily report to some sort of standard or some framework. You have audits, controls, timers, efficiency retrofits of your buildings. You're actually starting to do things that not only can you calculate for the first time because you're collecting the data that you needed, but you have an ROI. You're having a bunch of like low-hanging fruit that you can collect and say, we're actually improving the organizations, often saving money in this stage, and it just makes business sense from having quality management in place. And then you start getting people like finance managers involved and saying, I think we can go further. I think maybe there's some added benefits if we think outside the box. Should we be getting certified or recommissioning our buildings to go a step beyond? Should we look at renewable energy, both auditing our sites and installing things, or possibly we're doing renewable fuel assessments and converting some of our fleet? You might even get market-based tools. Definitely depends on what state you're in, but you can find long-term utility contracts or long-term off-site renewable energy contracts that you can actually buy down the price with a long-term contract that is just as cheap or cheaper than grid-based utilities. That's usually only about 5 or 6 states right now. Like I know Texas, Arkansas, Georgia are pretty big. Some of these utility contracts are the regulations there and the utility regulations are very favorable, but you can do some pretty creative leases, and you can host sites and lease the power back to the company who does it, but you really have to get outside of the box and look at some of that stuff to analyze it. And last is inspired leadership is getting involved and saying, we're actually going to take this as far as we can take it. We believe in it. It's a core issue. We're going to buy carbon credits or offsets. We're going to, maybe we're going to invest in 100% renewable energy. We're going to go after possibly a climate neutral certification. And we think we can leverage that not only for the company, but we think we can get that payback by, more inspired employees and recruitment and retention benefits, or our consumers really want it, our customers. And we think we can generate more sales if we go this route and use it as an on-package label or an on-company label, like the entire company is certified. And so that's really taking it to the highest level. You don't have to take it there. It's just performance at the bottom of this chart is the lowest level of performance, and that's the highest you can go. There's not much higher than being climate neutral. You can go off and do other maybe progressive things outside of the business, but as a business goes, that's where you kind of end. It's the cross the finish line type of achievement, and then maintaining that year over year would be, that's a look at what implementation looks like. We have another, well, if you're looking at climate specifically, we have great greenhouse gas trainings from starter, beginner to all the way. We will train you to be a lead verifier. Those are the types of people we hire, but it doesn't hurt to have lead verifier training if you want to get verification of your emissions later in the future. But you can take one course, you can take 2, and they just add on to each other until you're a fully qualified lead verifier. And those are coming up also in September. And then we have employee well-being, health and safety, if you will. Another incredibly important issue. But again, if you look at it from the same chart, you start at the very bottom. What's the lowest level of performance when it comes to the health and well-being of your employees? Well, hopefully your risk managers are trying to avoid this, but you do have major injuries, even fatalities. You can have high workers' comp claims. You can actually have fines, but even work stoppages. They just shut you down and say, you're not going to operate anymore until you fix this and get better. Hopefully you can move out of that quickly, and other risk managers are going to look at, okay, we're in compliance, but we still are not performing as well. We're avoiding injuries, we're avoiding fatalities, we're avoiding workers' comp claims, and we're avoiding fines and work stoppages. Again, compliance stage is the one that's it's nothing to write home about. You don't communicate it to many people because no one cares, because the message is we're not breaking the law, or we're not, we're not out of compliance with rules and regulations. But it is a very critical step that you have to build off of to take the next step, which is getting into your quality management and efficiency with the rhino of maybe we're going to not only do, we're minimizing injuries and claims, but we're going to start reporting near misses. We're going to do root cause tracking so that we can really get to this to as low as possible. And we might even start offering free biometric screenings to our employees and saying, hey, we want you to know how healthy you are. We think we can bring you back to work more. You'll less missed days, less hospital visits, things like that. If we can start providing some of these, like the beginning of data collection for positive outcomes, not just avoiding negative outcomes. And then you get into more kind of out of the box thinking with wellness. You start saying, hey, we've got this culture of safety. We're going to do lots of training. No one goes home without fingers or toes, but we're going to track these positive outcomes from the biometric screenings. And we're going to start targeting programming and adding additional investment in, hey, maybe we want to have a smoking cessation program. Maybe we want to have a weight loss program. Maybe we want to do some early detection for heart disease. Maybe we want to whatever it is, employees tend to love it, and they really appreciate more insight and more help, good health insurance as well, and saying, help us be healthy so we can come to work healthier and happier. And then last, if you have inspired leadership around employee health, you might start having what's called total worker health programs. They look at different aspects of health: social, environmental, community health, emotional health, things like this. You might bring on-site wellness services, blood drives on site. I'm trying to think of, some people have clinics. If you're a very large company, you actually bring in clinics for specific things, or have on-site massage days, or whatever it is you want to do. You actually bring it for the convenience factor to your site, and then you start getting recognized by some industry associations, industry journals, wellness associations, groups that give out wellness awards for companies, healthy estate initiatives, things like that. And that's really a kind of crossing the finish line, being recognized as one of the best places to work for employee health and wellness. It's a little harder to measure social, kind of the human side of these things. But there's pretty identifiable characteristics of a high-end program around employee health and well-being. We have one question, but that's just a general thank you. So last, I'll say, has your organization conducted a formal materiality assessment, which is to say, have you tried to identify what your ESG topics are and why, in a pretty formal approach? Typically, that involves some stakeholder engagement and really asking folks what their opinion is on things, but you also want that impact materiality, the investor-driven things. You can benchmark so many different framework standards or peer organizations, but typically you want to have some formal approach to it, and have you done that yourselves? Okay, I'm going to leave it open for a couple more seconds because I see some people still chiming in. 15. All right. So I'm going to share the results. This is also not uncommon. Don't know. No is the most, and then several have yes. So my hat's off to those who have done it. It's not simple and straightforward. It's not easy, but it definitely can be done, I think, in the most convenient ways possible and as efficiently as possible. But I want to get to the Q&A session and just say, we have something called a gap analysis that is a breakdown, not a full double materiality assessment for GRI and the European Union. Those are very in-depth, but we try to scale these things to people's liking and to make it accessible for smaller privately held companies. And then if you're a KCA member who wants to get into your next steps, obviously I can share with you what we can help with, but also just the steps. Even if you don't use someone like us, if you're seeing drivers in the industry for you to take on ESG or sustainability, whatever those might be, building internal competency for members of your team is essential. I will never, even if you don't use us, we have ESG training, we have greenhouse gas training. Those are things on us. We have the SGS Academy platform, but anywhere you can build those competencies, if you're reading books, if you're bringing in a speaker, if you're sending your team to an industry association meeting, focus on ESG and sustainability, whatever you want to look at it as, but build internal competency, because those people who have the internal competency should be the ones who then prioritize the material ESG topics for your business. You really need leaders. You need people who understand a broad sense of a lot of different topics for your industry and your business, and then prioritizing those. We can offer things like an ESG gap analysis. You can go really, really in depth for things called like a full double materiality assessment. If you have European threats and or risks with the supply chain. But then if you want to improve your score, if you have a specific agency that says they're giving you a poor score, EcoVadis, ISS, MSCI, Sustainalytics, if you have a poor score, you can go directly into that. What I would say is you want to not chase points. You should do it strategically. I wouldn't just try to improve your score if it's not aligned with your strategy. So you want to kind of do both at the same time, but there are ways, if it's really important and you have investors or some other stakeholder telling you, hey, your score is not good enough, you can do what we call as an ESG rating boost, but you can do some quick wins and really approach that strategically. And then if you want to start reporting, eventually you want to at least consider third-party assurance. And that's, you're going to report something, you want people to believe it, that you're not just greenwashing and making it up yourself and self-reporting. And most groups get into some form of third-party assurance. Greenhouse gas verification specifically is something that we provide, and others can provide it as well. But if you start doing an entire report, you might have ESG and sustainability report assurance, where lots of different KPIs from different social and environmental categories. We can also provide assurance to those like you would for your financials, but it's a different approach. Similar tools, but a slightly different approach. So I would just say, whether you use us or not, build competency, prioritize your topics, improve your score if you need to, consider third-party assurance. And then any questions you have, I'm here to answer them. I didn't see anybody typing in besides the 3 that we've already answered, but.
Adam, one question. The companies you just had on the last slide, Lowe's and Home Depot and Walmart, I think it was. How do they, outside the the feel good and employees are happy and the customers are, like, how are they leveraging what they're doing, an ROI on by leveraging their qualifications?
Well, all of them, like every single one of these companies has a very comprehensive, if you want to go find there, just type in the name with ESG report, you'll get a great example. It's not, the framework that they approach it with is very helpful. You'll recognize things. They're not themselves gonna, you shouldn't just do what they're doing, but the steps they went through, they're going to show their materiality assessment, stakeholder engagement, their priority material topics. And then you're going to notice, okay, we've got KPIs, we're reporting over time, but they're leveraging this in the same way others have. They've moved much quicker. Some of these have been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years, but they started out exactly where many of you might be. They didn't know. They started taking trainings, they started looking at their own materiality assessment, engaging with their stakeholders, and then building out a program. Most of them have 10, 15, 20 years of data year over year. And that's where you want to eventually get to, is to show and validate that, hey, we've been doing these kinds of projects, but we've improved performance. You can actually see the improved performance over time. They're using it, with their employees, they're using it with their investors. But if you look at their scores, they're using it with their creditors. So now they're looking at getting better financing, discounts on their financing, better rates. And the banks are typically using the scoring agencies because the banks themselves are not qualified. So they're leaning on a third party, which has a scoring methodology. And therefore, Walmart is saying they use CDP, all of these use CDP and EcoVadis. So if you've ever gotten an EcoVadis request from one of them, that's why. They're trying to show the scoring agencies that, hey, you should give us a better score on supply chain management because we do this with our own facilities and with our own people, but we've started tracking what do our major suppliers do, and they're getting better scores because their supply chain is improving and they're putting pressure and or incentives on their supply chain to improve. And so they're leveraging it with banks, investors, consumers, employees. But I promise you, they're doing it in the most financially responsible way they can, because these are huge companies and their investors want to see returns.
Got it. Thank you. And thank you again to you, Adam, and to Kim for this great information.
Thank you to the KCMA for having us, all the members who came. Thank you, everyone who watches the recording. If you have additional questions, we just really appreciate being asked, and we wish you the best in your ESG journey.
Thanks for having us.